Well, it's once again that time of year, Halloween. And yeah, we've heard this song and dance before, spooks and frights and whatnot, so let me just jump right to the point. I'm a huge wimp when it comes to horror. So rather than traumatize myself, I'm more inclined to enjoy media that's just spooky rather than something that'll actually scare me. And if there's any part of media that can invoke a certain Halloween-y feeling in me, it's atmosphere. And what better game series to invoke a spooky but not really atmosphere than Resident Evil? With so many entries in the franchise, there's a huge variety as to what type of atmosphere you'd want to go for. Something more traditional, action-y, hell, the more modern RE titles go for something a bit more grounded in reality, all of which are very effective. But I'm not talking about any of those. No, I'm going all the way back, baby, to the first one, just plain old Resident Evil.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
Yeah, this is probably the biggest example of a game being dated, but I think that gives it so much charm that you don't get from many games now. Of course, most people write off the original Resident Evil because, lo and behold, there's a remake of Resident Evil with the same title. Could you imagine getting remade and your remake is not only an improvement in every category, but is also considered one of the greatest games of all time? Yeah, Remake is one of my favorite video games ever made. It's sublime. But does that mean you should never go back to OG Resident Evil 1? Consider this video a comparison piece between the two titles. Because in my opinion, if you're gonna play one of these games, you should consider playing them both. Let's start with some background. The origins of Resident Evil date back to 1989 with the Famicom game Sweet Home developed by Capcom. Based upon the 1989 horror film, it was one of the early examples of a video game using horror as its focus. The game was a massive hit, so once the PlayStation 1 hit the scene, Capcom were looking to make a remake of Sweet Home. One thing led to another, however, and the remake of Sweet Home became a whole new game titled
Biohazard,
which was apparently copywritten at the time, so when it was localized to the West, it became
Resident Evil.
Resident Evil was directed by one Shinji Mikami, who would go on to become a legend in the industry. I mean, I too would give the guy who worked on Goof Troop a directing position of a gnarly horror game. He was apparently given the directing position because he, quote, hated being scared and understood what was frightening. In the same sense that Sweet Home was based upon a Japanese horror film, Resident Evil was made to pay homage to Western horror films, namely George A. Romero's Of the Dead series of films. Along with utilizing new hardware that allowed them to create 3D graphics that no one had ever seen before, Resident Evil was a massive hit and spiraled out to become one of the biggest gaming franchises to this day. Hell, the whole survival horror genre owes its name to this game. Resident Evil 1 coined the phrase survival horror, and now it's a huge genre with plenty of entries paying homage to this first title. Everything about it worked so well, it looked amazing, it had innovative gameplay, and above all else, it was scary.
Chris? Stop it.
At the time. Many look at this first title knowing how influential it was, but what was once a scary as hell game is a third grade stage play where you're surprised everyone remembered their lines. So later down the line in 2002, a remake of Resident Evil came out on the Nintendo GameCube, and it was really made because the original game had not aged well. But this remake was 100% a reimagining and idealistic version of the vision the original game had. Everything the original did, Remake did 20 times better. And can you really blame them? When your flagship title in one of your most popular horror franchises has farting trumpets in its soundtrack, you'd probably want to try it again too. So Remake is a direct replacement for Resident Evil, but I still feel like both entries hold merit, even if one of them is more for laughs than anything. So let's start with what remains the same between the two games. The plot is the exact same for one. Resident Evil takes place outside a fictional town called Raccoon City where there have been outlandish reports of grisly murders where the victims had been eaten. And an elite task force in Raccoon City named STARS sends out their Bravo team to investigate the nearby Arklay Mountains, but all communication gets cut off. So STAR's Alpha team, consisting of Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, Brad Vickers, Joseph Frost, and the captain Albert Wesker, are sent to locate Bravo team. During their investigation, they locate Bravo team's helicopter in disrepair, and soon after they're attacked by rabid dogs.
Joseph! No! Don't go!
Joseph is killed by the dogs and Brad abandons the team, leaving Chris, Jill, Barry, and Wesker to flee to the nearby mansion. This is where an important choice comes into play. When you start a new playthrough, you get to choose to either play as Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine. If you're Chris, he, Jill, and Wesker make it to the mansion with Barry missing.
Barry. Where's Barry?
He's...
No. What was that?
The team hears a rogue gunshot and Chris is sent to investigate, and what Chris discovers is probably one of the most effective scenes in gaming history. Chris rushes back to the entrance hall only to discover both Jill and Wesker are missing. So Chris sets off to locate the missing team in a safe way out of the mansion. Now if you play as Jill, she, Wesker, and Barry are safe with Chris missing.
Hey, Wesker, where's Chris?
Jill, no. You don't want to go back out there.
But we've got to find...
What was that?
After the gunshot, both Jill and Barry set off to investigate only to discover zombies. They retreat only to discover that Wesker is missing, so they split up to locate their missing members in a safe way out. The plot of Resident Evil is very much that of a 90s zombie flick, and it goes from a normal traditional kind of horror film to more sci-fi near the end, and it keeps you glued to the screen the whole time. Both games have the same story beats, though Remake does add a few things, as well as a little subverting for those who have played the original game. But the plot and characters are the same between both the original and Remake. What is also the same between the two versions is the core survival horror gameplay. Control-wise, both games default to tank controls, common with early survival horror games. Left and right turn you in those directions, and up and down let you walk forward and back respectively. This control scheme takes some getting used to, and some people can't wrap their head around them, but once you do get used to them, it plays like a dream. These controls are useful because the game works with these fixed camera angles, while also allowing for normal gameplay to look more cinematic. It makes it so there isn't really any 3D camera tomfoolery that you'd get from early 3D games. Not to mention that it allows the game to hide certain things from your field of vision, making it easier for enemies to sneak up on you or keep something hidden until you get too close. Might be considered a little cheap to some, but it does help add to the game's emphasis on horror through gameplay. Yeah, these controls and camera angles aren't necessarily the most user-friendly, but Resident Evil aims to make the game scary because you have to jump through so many hoops to survive an encounter with one zombie. It makes your anxiety run high, especially given the survival horror staple of having to work with limited resources. You can only carry so many items with you at a time, and each item aside from weapons are all consumables. And they're all also very scarce, so you have to make sure you are using everything as effectively as possible. Every bullet counts, every health item should only be used when absolutely necessary. Hell, you can't even save the game without using the ink ribbon item, which there's only so many of those as well. What sucks more is that key items used for progression, like keys or puzzle items, also take up inventory space. And once you pick up an item, you cannot put it down, so expect a lot of backtracking to safe rooms on first playthroughs. This is really where the survival aspect of the game lies. Of course, if you get good with juking and jiving around enemies, this makes things a lot easier, but sometimes it really will be a decision between using bullets or taking a hit and risk having to use a health item. And even with the janky PS1 version, I still can't help but feel a sense of foreboding while I play because of this gameplay style. It's really effective. Each enemy is a fucking bullet sponge, especially in the remake. It takes so many bullets to take them down. Well, unless you use the shotgun, but even then you only have so many bullets you can use, and there are a ton of enemies in the game. Like, yeah, you get used to the zombies, they're tough, but they're slow and easy to work around. What about those fucking hunters? They fast as fuck, man! And strong too, like if your health is low enough, they can just chop your head off. And don't get me started on the freaking Crimson Heads in the remake, oh my god. It makes every enemy encounter feel like that much more of a rush. No matter how many times I play these games or memorize enemy locations, it always still gives me an anxious feeling whenever I enter a room that I know has enemies in it. Another aspect of the gameplay I've yet to mention is the differences between Chris and Jill. Story-wise, while they're the same, events will play out a little differently. Jill gets to have Barry back her up in a lot of situations, coming to save the day or give her items. Chris doesn't have Barry. Actually, do they ever even meet in Chris's playthrough, even though that's the first thing he asks? You know, where's Barry?
Barry! Where's Barry?
No, Chris finds Stars Bravo Team's newbie Rebecca Chambers, who will come to Chris's aid during gameplay.
What? Oh no!
In segments where you get to play as her, no less. A lot less like Barry will, who like bust down doors or shoot enemies, and more of the fact that Rebecca is just smarter than Chris. Using serum, mixing chemicals, learning how to play the piano, stuff like that. Gameplay-wise, however, Chris has less inventory space and has to use small keys to open up drawers, but he can take a lot more hits than Jill can. And this helps because, at least in the PS1 version, it feels like Chris has to deal with a lot more aggressive enemies than Jill does. Jill, on the other hand, gets to have more inventory space and has a lockpick she can use to open up those small drawers, but she can't take as many hits, though like I said, it seems like the enemies are less aggressive in her playthrough, and Jill can also find a grenade launcher weapon during her playthrough while Chris can't. While it may be the same map and mostly the same items, the two playthroughs feel wholly different and it makes for some strong replayability. The gameplay and story are the two aspects of Resident Evil that remain mostly the same between the two titles, but from here on we'll be talking about the differences. And I say that because no matter how I feel about the original Resident Evil, graphically it aged very much in the last 20 plus years. But it's aged in the same way that your grandparents aged. Yeah, they look old, but that's all you've ever known them as, and it gives them their cute old charm. Resident Evil came out in 96. I was born in 97. And I was a wimp when I was a kid, so the one time I saw my uncle play the opening segment at my grandma's house, it was enough for me to be like, I didn't play Resident Evil until the winter of 2019, but I've always known Resident Evil as a very old-looking game. So going into it knowing this fact, it has a look that is very PS1 feeling. The characters are polygonal and jagged, but it's something that you only get from this era of gaming. And I personally feel like it adds to Resident Evil's charm of being an early PS1 game. But let's not mince words here. Remake looks incredible, even back originally on the GameCube. Everything from the PS1 original has been remade and reimagined to look the way I'd imagined they were going for back in the original game. Ironically, both games use pre-rendered backgrounds, basically 2D images they use to appear like fully 3D environments. While it's obvious in the OG, Remake you would never know, they look incredible. And model-wise, I mean, look at this, and now look at this. These games are 6 fucking years apart, dude. These are like real characters. They show emotions now, move like humans. The zombies too give you more of a sense that they're undead and mindless. I'm not trying to discredit how revolutionary the OG game was, but really it's like night and day here. They improved everything about the game to make it that much more immersive. Like, say, the voice acting.
Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
Resident Evil 1 is infamous for its hulky voice acting, and this is because the game was directed by Japanese people translating their scripts to English and having whoever happened to natively speak English nearby at the time to do the voices. Not to mention that they spliced takes together sometimes to what sounded cooler to them. So like this line from Wesker.
Don't open that door!
It's actually 4 takes where he emphasized a different word each time and they just use the emphasized words. Let's not kid ourselves though. The terrible voice acting is amazingly hilarious and has made RE1 a meme cornucopia. Like how many times have we heard, "You were almost a Jill sandwich," or "Hope this is not Chris's blood." It gives this game so much unintended charm and I love every second a line is being read.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
But again, Remake takes the voice acting and actually makes it better and not make the characters sound like aliens pretending to be human. They have actual personalities and genuine emotions now. And there's still some silly lines, but they sound a lot more genuine this time around.
Barry.
That was a close one. A second late, you would have fit nicely into a sandwich.
Really?
What helps is that they added a subplot involving a character named Lisa Trevor. I won't go too deep into it because goddamn it's probably the best part about Remake. But just know that this is something where the original game's goofy nature would have actually ruined it. The new acting does make Remake more immersive, but I gotta say, I really do dig the old-ass live-action cutscenes the OG game has. They're only live-action for the opening and endings, but they're so grimy and low-budget looking. Apparently the shooting of this was much like the voice acting. They just got whoever happened to speak English and was living in Japan at the time and they did a quick and dirty shoot. The opening cutscene is iconic and it was actually censored in the original version of the game. The director's cut version of the game said to uncensor this in the first zombie cutscene too, but that was actually just a localization error. But as it turns out, the cutscene did have an uncensored version in the code, just had to switch a 0 to a 1. So the fan-made uncut version of Resident Evil 1 made it so we could see these cutscenes in all their low-budget glory. Speaking of which, the uncut version also reverted the original game soundtrack back to the initial release as well. See, Resident Evil had a pretty good soundtrack. But when the DualShock version of the game was being released, the soundtrack was recomposed by Mamoru Samuraguchi, who was known to be deaf at the time.
Which was a lie.
And the result was the infamous Clowns Farting soundtrack. Needless to say, Remake's soundtrack aims to harken back to the foreboding nature of the original soundtrack. And these are some sinister tracks, man, like damn. It's pretty clear that Remake is just 100% a better overall game, so why on earth would you go back to the original Resident Evil? Well, like I said, when it comes to spooky media that I enjoy, it's all about atmosphere. And yeah, Remake's atmosphere is the route I enjoy going more too, but RE1 does have a unique charm to the way it approaches its atmosphere. Despite the hulky voice acting and the dated look, just the ambience of walking a hall with the original soundtrack is a vibe all to its own. Even just selecting a character gives me that spooky vibe I'm looking for with Halloween media. It's not anywhere near as effective as Remake is though. Remake is the perfect game in terms of being something only Resident Evil can be. Even future RE games don't match the tone that this one does. For as good as RE4 all the way up to the most recent RE Villages, Remake is the only Resident Evil game that feels like it's a fully realized version of a Resident Evil game. If you're gonna play one of them, play Remake, and if you plan to play more than one of them, play Remake twice. But if you had your Remake fill, going through the original game isn't a bad idea either. It's still a unique experience that, while has been improved on, is fun to see how it started. And above all else, there's nothing like having a cool fall evening with a bunch of friends playing through this hilariously dated game, laughing at all the dialogue and getting hype at beating all the bosses. That's all Halloween is to me, having fun with friends and laughing at spooky media. Cause I mean, hey, what are you gonna do instead? Watch the Resident Evil movies? Now that's scary.
I got a shotgun.
Chris Redfield. Jill Valentine. Barry Burton. Rebecca Chambers. Albert Wesker. Resident Evil.